Okay, so now what I've done here, I've included, because obviously we're now doing this as almost a direct rebuttal for the benefit of HM Treasury and the Treasury Select Committee. So I've included quite a number of slides from previous ones just to give a bit of background. So I'm going to skirt through them so that we have, hang on, let me just find my button. So skirt through them so that it's there, it's on the record, and we can recap. So basically this is dedicated to, I've called it the FCA's dishonesty double down since Panorama. I really expected the FCA, once Panorama went out, to finally go, okay, fair cop, we dropped the ball, picked the ball up, and properly investigate and make sure the victims got proper remedy. The opposite's happened, and the best way to describe it is a dishonesty double down since. And this is the purpose of this, is to bring everyone up to speed. So I'm going to whiz through again. I don't make an allegation unless I've got the evidence to back it up. And what you're going to see today, and the reason why there's so many slides, is because I want to make sure the evidence is there so that it's irrefutable, nobody can challenge it. So I'm going to skirt through these ones here. Blackmore Bond collapses, yada, yada, yada. This is the key thing. Neither Blackmore Bond or its mini bonds are regulated by the FCA. This was a major thing that they put out the moment it collapsed. This is something that they all ignored. So they're talking about the bonds were not regulated. What I and others reported, and when you see my emails in March 2017, I'm not talking about the product. I'm talking about the fact that this is being marketed and sold to non-sophisticated investors. They're being lied to. They're being told it's guaranteed by one of the world's largest banks, and they're having their sophistication manipulated. They are, and I'm quoting it word for word, what I'm hearing next door to us. We will put you down as sophisticated. So they're manipulating the sophistication with one purpose: to circumvent FSMA and COBS. Now, FSMA and COBS both prohibit the sale of unregulated investment products to non-sophisticated investors, right? So that's the key thing that I and others were reporting. Why were we doing it? Because we're all professionals. We know that that's a breach of FSMA and COBS, and that's where it brings it squarely into the centre of the FCA's perimeter authority and powers. So these are just a couple of things that Dame Gloucester referred to: self-certification, wrong, etc. Again, this is the FSMA and FCA codes that apply. As you can see there, it's prohibited to sell all this non-regulated investment products to non-sophisticated individuals. I'm sorry if I'm rushing, but I really want to just squeeze through. So, and the FCA was ignoring this part. When they were dishing out representations, they were ignoring that this was the key thing. And to market or sell any non-regulated investment product to non-sophisticated investors is a breach of the COBS, breach of FSMA, and it is to carry on, therefore, a regulated activity without the permissions to do so. This is what falls within the FCA scope, perimeter, and mandate, and it applies more so if the firm doing it is themselves not regulated, because the whole purpose of the regulation or the act is to make sure these firms get regulated to outlaw the cowboys and don't let them in. That's the whole point. So it applies more so to non-regulated firms. So I'm going to whiz through some of these products absolutely within the perimeter. Again, more stuff here that from Dame Gloucester's report, about what they did, what they didn't do, and various failures. Now, this is the FCA's response. That Dame Gloucester pointed out that there was evidence that people were being coached to put themselves down as sophisticated. This is what I'm talking about in terms of manipulation of sophistication. And this is the FCA's response. They don't deny that that's an offence, right? So, but what they do say is that this type of practice can be difficult for us to identify and stop. And that's what galls me probably the most about those initial things from the FCA and Gloucester, because I was telling them where we were. I was telling them where we were, the office next door to us, where this is going on, exactly what they said it's difficult to identify and stop. So I'm just going to go through these. As you can see, I'm liaising with the FCA in March 2017. I think I'm helping the FCA. And I'm saying here, please stress, whoever you pass this up to and escalate this to, pensioners are being targeted, right? I can't be any more specific than that. And I'm assured they will do. Again, giving out some of the pitch that we were hearing next door. This is like real-time intelligence, and they know where we are, we're next door. And this is what the offices look like. So you can see, we could hear and see everything that was going on next door. And this should have been the worst nightmare for this boiler room, right? They set up next to a team of highly experienced financial market professionals, and but instead of being their worst nightmare, we may have been a nursery or preschool set up next door for all the good it did. We were reporting stuff in real time, and it made not a jot of difference. So, and this is where the escalation to Mark Stewart and Andrew Bailey, when I discovered this outfit still operating, you know, a year and a half after my initial reports. So I'd say this is just skirting through it, but this is important, and I want to come back to this later. Mark Stewart on 21st September 2018 confirms we've received reports and we're making inquiries. So just bookmark this date. This is when the FCA started making inquiries. Okay, so that's the start date of their investigation. I say to them, don't apologise to me. You know, I'm the one being conned out of their pensions. Now, this is an MOU between City of London Police and the FCA. I'm just going to skirt through it, but it basically establishes that they share information with each other, yada, 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 and, you know, things that fall out of their scope, all of this kind of stuff. And you can see the FCA signed by Mark Stewart, and it's signed in March 17, the very month where I make my reports. This is just a new version, so there was one that was in place before it. So this is another report from an IFA, an FCA authorised IFA who reports Blackmore Bond and the two directors. And again, focusing on the sophisticated issues and the fact that this is potentially a scam, they're guaranteeing the investments and everything else, refers to prior history of these two directors, Nunn and McCreesh, and I'm calling them now fraudsters and scammers because they are. All the evidence I've got, I can back that up with. Okay, so and he basically goes through the whole cabal and again refers to FCA, COBs, etc., etc. So again, all squarely within the perimeter of the FCA. And he goes on to say at the end, oh, actually, there's a part where this is what, and he highlights the powers that the FCA has in this instance. Go into Blackmore Bond, order them to immediately close to new investment, and the self-certification. It's not enough as per FCA COBS 4.12. So you can mandate the firm and compel them to prove to you the due diligence and KYC they've undertaken to establish that this person's sophisticated. Self-certification was outlawed and prohibited by the FCA in 2016. So it's all there. And he points out that the damage to the FCA's reputation, if Blackmore Bonds defaults to the FCA, could be incredibly damaging. And you know, obviously we know that is the case. So again, I'm just going to skirt through this because it's but this is quite important that Stewart says that this is a statement by Mark Stewart. The FCA again reminds consumers not to invest in schemes being offered by firms that are not authorised by the FCA and they look too good to be true, like these ones. This is referring to another scam because it will inevitably collapse. So he knows. Now, the FCA has taken, I'm including these links here, and I will share the deck afterwards so you can click the links and you can expand on these. These are all examples where the FCA took action and exercised the powers they had in respect to non-authorised and non-regulated firms selling non-regulated investment products. So it's nonsense and it's false for them to claim they had no powers. Indeed, in 2018, in the bottom here, you can see that they actually bought and secured 5 fraud convictions against people. The FCA did this, not the police. The FCA bought 5 fraud prosecutions against 5 individuals, none of whom were authorised or regulated, all of whom were involved in selling non-regulated investment products, exactly as per Blackmore Bond. So they did have the powers. With all of these, there seems to be a commonality. Where they take action, it appears to be where they haven't dropped the ball before. And obviously Blackmore Bond, they absolutely dropped the ball and then they treated it differently because they're more worried about their own reputation. So, but this is the press release by Mark Stewart following those convictions. You know, he says these fraudsters callously targeted investors who are often elderly and vulnerable, you know, lying them to get to them to part with significant sums of money. Yet all this exactly as I reported, they were targeting vulnerable pensioners. So Stewart here and the FCA admits that they know pensioners are vulnerable and they are therefore owed a much greater duty of care by the FCA because they're vulnerable. There's vulnerabilities all over FCA COBs, PRIN and everything that, you know, vulnerable people need more protection and the FCA has the powers to act. So again, but here, again, I want to skirt through, but this is important. August 19, I find this mob still operating, I report it again. So here it is, I report it to Mark Stewart. And list all the things that we'd raised earlier, and I don't want to go over that in too much detail. But the FCA was still coming out with this: we don't have power to investigate a firm that is unauthorised and not carrying out any regulated activities, even if there are circumstances that suggest there may be fraud, which is completely false, as proven by the fraud prosecutions the FCA brought. So, moving on, this was something that Alison Thewlis of the Treasury Select Committee asked Andrew Bailey regarding LCNF. Do you accept the possibility, had the contact centres been clearer, an adequate escalation to the relevant departments, that customers would have suffered less detriment? Bailey said yes. Well, that Blackmore Bond proves that that's nonsense, because they knew about Blackmore Bond before they knew about LCNF. And they knew about Blackmore Bond 3 years before its collapse, and still the outcome was the same. People lost everything. Now, and one thing that Blackmore Bond highlights that is that the FCA claim that all 600 reports to the FCA about LCNF never made it out of the contact centres. However, the evidence I've got shows that not just mine, but every report about Blackmore Bond made it out of the contact centres to the relevant department. And that they ran in parallel. How does that occur? And it begs the question: did the FCA doctor the documentary record to conceal that? And I refer you to John Swift QC, now Casey, and Dame Gloucester, who both raised serious concerns about the keeping of the contemporary records by the FCA and records that were missing. And the FCA even admitted to him that their record keeping was poor. Poor. There's a fine line between poor and dishonest, should we say, or non-disclosure or withholding information. So, as you may know, multiple people reported Blackmore Bond to Action Fraud. They all got this fob-off response. On this occasion, based on the information, it's not been possible to identify a line of inquiry which a law enforcement organisation in the UK could pursue. Complete nonsense. And these are just a few of the many that victims got back, all saying the same thing: no lines of inquiry. Nonsense. This is because the NFIB knew of this investigation into Capita Oak pension, which was initiated by the SFO in May 2017. None of McCreesh are under investigation as part of that, because they got 600 grand for inducing people to invest in this scam. And I think there was 120 million lost in that one. This one here, again, this is the SFO investigation of LCNF. Surge Financial are part of that, are subject to that investigation. Their director was arrested, questioned, and released pending further investigation. Now, Surge were paid over £6 million for inducing people to invest in Blackmore Bond. So you've got two. The NFIB say there's no lines of inquiry. It's just wrong. We're not saying that there's no evidence to convict. It's a line of inquiry. There are two blatant lines of inquiry here that would be ignored and buried. There's no way the Action Fraud or NFIB did not know about these when literally misleading investors as to there being no lines of inquiry. City of London Police, they responded to a freedom of information request, whereby I and the Daily Telegraph also did one. Can you please provide information regarding the amount of reports and when they occurred in respect to Blackmore Bond and any other Blackmore vehicle? Here you go. The City of London Police provided all that information, as they should. I made the same request to the FCA this year and referred to this. The FCA refused to provide the information on the basis that it was vexatious. But the City of London Police provided it, and every other regulator I know is happy to provide those, well, not always happy, but they will provide the information in respect to reports and complaints, etc., but not the FCA. So we still don't know how many other people reported Blackmore Bond beyond myself and the IFA in 2018. So after the last fob off, I then submitted a report to Action Fraud. Right, let's see them try and fob me off. And I literally dumped all my evidence I had at the time to a City of London Police email address, said, there you go, get on with that. Don't claim there's no lines of inquiry, to see if they would fob me off. And that was in June 21. Then I get this response eventually, that was in April 21. This is in June 21, where lo and behold, the City of London Police confirmed that everyone's agreed that they're going to, that the Insolvency Service is going to investigate the matter. And this is all being agreed by the FCA, SFO, and City of London Police. Conveniently, the Insolvency Service has probably the most limited scope of all of them. They don't have a mandate to investigate or explore what ball dropping went on in the FCA and in City of London Police. They were just focusing on the on the company. So, but it's interesting, and again, later on this will become more relevant. I spoke to the Insolvency Service investigator, and she told me that she had literally, in June 21, only just been given the instruction to investigate. And yet Kroll, the liquidators of Blackmore Bond, had made their report after 3 months in June 2020, a year earlier. They had to make an initial report as their statutory obligation requires, and they raised serious concerns with the Insolvency Service as to Blackmore Bond and what they had discovered upon going in. So why did the Insolvency Service take a year to open an investigation? So, and this was me contacting the Insolvency Service investigator. I spent a lot of time on the phone with her, and I shared with her the Blackmore Bond video, the Blackmore Bond presentation I did for the TTF back in 2021. So plenty of evidence for them to digest. Now, that's not too bad, 53 slides down. Right, so now August last year, many of you will have seen the BBC Panorama programme, the £1 billion savings scandal. Now, we spent 9 months working on this and preparing it, and I think the producers and the directors and the team, they did an amazing job. And one of the things that it was so important to get across, and they did it so well, was that it was the targeting of non-sophisticated individuals. That was the focus. That's the clear and unequivocal breach of FSMA and FCA COBS, as I've said before. And they really got that message across. And it exposed everything the FCA was saying beforehand. Oh, there's nothing we can do. It's all beyond their perimeter of authority and powers. So this really did force that into the picture. And the FCA then, all they've done since is seek to change the narrative again. So, and many of you will remember that the weekend after the Panorama, Mark Stewart did an interview with the Sunday Times. I mean, complete nonsense. It was just a damage limitation exercise. And there was all hell broke loose on the Sunday morning when the original story went out with the tagline, FCA, don't blame us for lost millions, blame the government. All hell broke loose, and within a few hours it was changed. But then the tagline wasn't changed to anything better for the FCA, because it says, it quoted Stewart saying, there's no such thing as a risk-free investment, says the regulator. That's what Stewart actually said. And there's a significance to that. And I'll come to that. So, yeah, and one thing Mr. Rathy said when he took over and he first addressed the Treasury Select Committee in his capacity as CEO, he bemoaned how labour and resource intensive after the event investigations are, right? But, well, then don't allow the fraud to incur in the first place. Be proactive, investigate intelligence and reports that you have, and not only will it then be much more easy and efficient to deal with, but it also acts as a deterrent to future ones. If you don't do anything, it just encourages future, future offending. So now, one thing about Panorama that I want you to say, I didn't pull punches in Panorama. I made some serious allegations about the FCA that they dropped the ball in March 17. In August 2018, Bailey, Stewart and the FCA realised they'd dropped the ball, and instead of picking it up, they dishonestly sought to bury the ball and bury the investors along with it. That's a punchy allegation, right? Now, and under rule of law, Bailey and the FCA were all given the right to reply. They could have said, that's not true, you have to take that out. They didn't. All they did instead was try and put forward a different narrative in the hope that people believe them over me. But the bottom line is, they could have thought, if what I was saying was false, they had the right to force the BBC to withdraw that. They didn't. And Bailey himself refused to comment at all. So I'm accepting that as their acceptance that they knew what I was saying was truth and fact. And what did they do? They tried to introduce a different narrative that was entirely false. And I'm going to dissect it here now. So Mr. Stewart in the Times interview and the FCA in the Panorama programme represented that they had shared intelligence with City of London Police in 2017. And they did it so as to deny my allegations that they'd failed to act on my reports and intelligence in 2017. But, and we now know, this was rather false and or misleading by way of omission of some rather key detail. Okay, so in December, you may now have seen the letter that Nicola Rathy wrote to the Treasury Select Committee. It was published, I think, a couple of weeks ago, and it made a bit of a splash in the media, where he admits that he says the FCA shared intelligence in relation to Blackmore Bond with City of London Police in 2017, although regrettably human error meant that the full suite of information was not sent across. Huge human error, and it has significant consequences, right? So both Stewart and the FCA and Mr. Rathie, initially failed to share that material piece of information about the human error. So maybe the FCA, Rathie and Stewart weren't aware of that piece of glaring failure when they were making these representations. Well, they were, because in a letter to me in 21st of December 2021, which is a year earlier than Rathie makes his admission, I have all this stuff coming to me. They confirmed that they opened an investigation with FSMA powers. So again, contradictory what they'd originally been saying. And it went to the unauthorized business department. And then they say, so in April 2017, they opened an investigation. But subsequent to this, the FCA became aware of pre-existing investigation by another law enforcement agency, which included activity being undertaken by AMEMA. So what did the FCA do? By this time, they've got my reports and intelligence. They've got that, but they've now been contacted by a police force investigating this. So there's some serious stuff going down here. And the FCA said, in order to avoid the risk of prejudice to that investigation, the FCA's investigation into AMEMA was closed in July 17. And in another document, the FCA confirmed that they didn't bother telling anyone about the concerns and risks that AMEMA and Blackmore Bond posed. That's in another Freedom of Information request. So, but they say to avoid the risk of prejudice, they closed their own investigation down. But in the same letter, they confirmed the underlying details of this intelligence, which would have included your March 2017 communications, were, however, unfortunately not shared due to human error. They admit the human error a year earlier, but don't mention the human error in Panorama or in the interview afterwards. Rathie only admits it after I point out to the Treasury Select Committee and others that this letter existed and this human error occurred. So far from sharing information, they compromised the City of London Police investigation. Because if you say to City of London Police, yeah, we've heard something, but you don't share the smoking gun intelligence, then the police investigation is going to go, we haven't got any evidence to pursue an inquiry. So they compromised the police investigation. And if, as the evidence suggests, the City of London Police didn't take it further, to what extent was that response a result of the FCA failing to share the real key evidence with them? So it's just astonishing. But these belated admissions to the human error and the FCA confirmation of the same to me is still not a full and honest representation of the facts and events within the FCA following my March 2017 reports. So in July 2020, I get this. This is a Freedom of Information response from the FCA in response to what did you do in response to my complaints? And in this one, they make an entirely different version of events. So in this one, they confirm, yes, they got my reports in March 2017, and an investigation was undertaken. And this is the key. In May 17, the FCA formed the view that Blackmore was not carrying on regulated activities without FCA authorization because it fell within the exclusion. Absolute nonsense, because we've already established what they were doing and what I reported was squarely within the perimeter. They were marketing and selling to non-sophisticated investors. Now, this is incredibly important, because what this proves is that the FCA did nothing. The FCA, according to this, shut it down. They shut it down in May 2007 and did nothing because they made a judgment that there was no regulated activity. The judgment's incorrect, and basically what's happened thereafter is all the false representations by the FCA to try and claim that they did do something. This proves that they shut it down, did nothing, and had made an incorrect determination and ignored the fact that the FSMA and COBS was being breached. A very important little note here that's become very important given some evidence from that's just come in. They confirm here that from March 2017, NCM Fund Service, an FCA authorised firm, approved the content of Blackmore's financial promotions. There's a reason for that, because the promotions have to be approved by an FCA regulated and authorised company to make sure they are fair, clear and not misleading and satisfy, and that's a specific requirement of FCA COBS, that all communications to retail customers must be fair, clear and not misleading, and also be accurate, right? So this company had to approve those documents and had to rubber stamp the authenticity and the accuracy of them. So where do we get here? Oh, yeah, so Mr. Rathie also writes in December 22 to the Treasury Select Committee, we do not agree with the assertion that we ignored intelligence about AMEMA received in 2007. That's a lie, because we've already seen the evidence that proves that they did nothing. They buried it. They literally made a determination in May 2017, wrongly, There was no breach of FISMA or COBS, so they buried it, right? So, you know, that's a false representation. We've already seen that the sharing of information strictly under the police is a complete red herring because they compromised the investigation by not sharing the relevant information. But Mr. Rathie, to the Treasury Select Committee, then seeks to use this to justify, oh no, we did take action in response to that intelligence received in 2017. He says to the Treasury Select Committee in his letter, in March 2019, the FCA took steps which led to the removal of AMEMA's website. Following this, AMEMA's appointed representative status was terminated in September 2019. To be clear, he is using this to deny allegations they did nothing in response to my March 17 reports. He's saying that this was a direct result of that. Whereas AMEMA didn't even become FCA authorised as an appointed rep until July 2018. So how can the removal of their approved status have been a result of the stuff that I sent to the FCA in March 2017, when in actual fact, they buried that and then they went and authorised AMEMA in 2018. The action in 2019 is therefore, it's dishonest to say that was a result of the intelligence I shared in March 17, because if it had been, they'd never have authorised them in the first place. Absolutely sickening that Rathie would, it's bad enough they've been deceiving investors. Here he literally makes a false and misleading representation to the Treasury Select Committee. So, and let's not forget, Mr. Rathie owns the register. So he will know that information exists and he made a false representation in respect to it. The other thing in Panorama, they were adamant, and this is the defence that they used, and Stuart had said this before, the FCA will not be able to act if an investor ticked a box saying they were sophisticated. False, because in 2016, the FCA prohibited any firms from accepting self-certification by tick box by a consumer as to their sophistication. The FCA from 2016 had demanded that all firms must undertake due diligence and take steps to establish and validate that each and every investor was sophisticated. It was clear they weren't, and it was clear they were manipulating the sophistication and telling people to tick that box, which Dane Gloucester had referred to, and is a horrifying breach of FISMA and an absolute attempt to circumvent FISMA. So the FCA relied on a process they themselves had prohibited to justify doing nothing. I mean, it's astonishing. Rathie also says this, you know, he also says the same when he writes to the Treasury Select Committee in the December, and he confirms the loans or mini bonds with marketed as only being suitable for restricted, high net worth, sophisticated or self-sophisticated investors. But he relies again on the self-certified sophisticated investors. The same certificate that was prohibited in 2016, the year Blackmore Bond launched. So anyone self-certifying sophistication, you know, it was unacceptable for these firms to accept that. But Mr. Rathie tries to use it as if that's some kind that absolves them of all responsibility, when it doesn't. What that does, it puts it even further into the FCA's remit. Mark Stewart, the headline for the in the Sunday Times interview, there's no such thing as a risk-free investment, says the regulator. This was another own goal by Stewart, because he acknowledges there's no such thing as a risk-free investment. Okay, well, when I made my reports in March 2017, I'm reporting that these people are flogging a risk-free investment, right? So therefore, you knew that that had to be a scam or that had to be a fraud, and you still did nothing. And was it a fraud? Yes, it was, because they were telling people that these bonds that they're pushing they're telling pensioners they are guaranteed by one of the world's largest banks. Stewart knows that that's nonsense. He knows that this is representing a risk-free investment. But I've worked for many of the world's largest banks. No bank in the world is ever going to offer that. So you don't need the benefit of hindsight to know that was a false representation and therefore fraud, because it was made with intent to make financial gain. And Stewart knows that. And Stewart, obviously, with the MOU, had the obligation to report that to City of London Police and didn't. So I did another freedom of information request to the FCA and said, what's the protocol for the FCA if they receive reports and intelligence about something that's beyond their perimeter authority powers? We signpost the provider, i.e. me or others, to the relevant appropriate agency or to make information available to the appropriate agency. Since March 2017, in all the times I've reported stuff to the FCA, they never once signposted me to any other agency, right? So this further proves that they knew that this was all well within their perimeter authority powers, because they didn't signpost me. They just took it, they ran with it because they knew full well everything I was reporting was squarely within their perimeter. And this is from the horse's mouth. This is from Mark Stewart. So, and it's, we've got the investigation we know started in August 2018. We're still going in September 2019, 13 months later, with them two Mark Stewart emails. If it's not in your perimeter authority and powers, then you know that within an hour, right? So why are you spending 13 months investigating something that you later say was beyond your perimeter authority and powers? Complete nonsense. If you're lifting a thing to investigate to that extent, you know full well it is. And therefore, when you say afterwards it wasn't, then you're lying. So, and this just reviews some other bits and pieces where this is the obfuscation from Stewart. We do not comment on operational managers. And again, this is the thing. Not once did they ever engage with me in all these years. Which next month, March, it's going to be 6 years, and not once have the FCA ever engaged with me. And again, here never points me to another authority, so knows full well that it's all within their perimeter and powers. Now we come on to this document. This is the letter that we featured in Panorama. Okay, now this was in a DSAR response that I got, and this was in October 2021. And it's like, you can see it here, it says, sent by email to me, got my email address. And it's like, hang on, I've never seen this before. I had made a complaint to the FCA in September 2019 that they'd failed to act upon my reports and intelligence. But this, when I opened this in my DSAR response, this was October 21, 2 years later. But what this means here, the highlight, it was the draft. So this is and this is October 2020. So this was the draft produced by the investigator that had spent 13 months investigating my complaint, okay? Reviewed all of the evidence, and I've got 2,000 internal FCA documents, most of them heavily redacted, that show they were doing a massive investigation of various things. For example, there's one document where the title is Blackmore Bond Associated Companies. The rest of it's redacted, but the bloody document runs for 5 pages. So let's not kid ourselves in terms of what the FCA, maybe they didn't have everything available. So, and obviously this is the letter that had the smoking gun comment across it. So this is the guy that's investigating for 13 months. And he concludes, however, I consider there was a missed opportunity to reconsider and act on the separate intelligence you provided. That was in respect to 2007. It says, again, he says they missed the opportunity again in August 2018. But as you can see, it's crossed out, right? So they clearly, this guy's produced it and someone's crossed it out. Now, this guy spent 13 months investigating it. Now, the FCA, but their defence, when asked by Panorama, they claimed, no, the findings were changed because new evidence came to light. And Mr. Rathie writes the same to Siobhan McDonough of the Treasury Select Committee in that letter. She said, Ms. McDonough stated that she understood the FCA confirmed in writing that it had missed an opportunity to act in relation to Blackmore bonds. So Rathie then says, as noted in the BBC Panorama programme, the FCA has explained that the discrepancy between the draft response to the complaint mentioned in the DSAR and the final response was due to new evidence coming to light. What new evidence? What could possibly have come to light after October 2020, right? After 3 years after my reports and 2 and a bit years after the FCA started an investigation. And this guy investigated this for 13 months. What new evidence could have come to light that changes that conclusion, that we didn't drop the ball? How do you go from confirmation and conclusion that we did drop the ball big time to, no, we didn't drop the ball? What possible evidence could have come to light to change that conclusion? I mean, I've asked the FCA, they refuse to correspond. Somebody tell me, please, because if you can, and I'd really like to see the Treasury Select Committee ask that question because I think it's a valid question. So complete nonsense here. This guy concluded this after 13 months. And the other thing that really does destroy Mr. Rathie's argument, the person who produced that original complaint response after 30 months investigation is hauled off of it after producing that, replaced by somebody else entirely, who then spends a year investigating and produces a different response. Nonsense. Why did you change the guy who'd been investigating for 13 months? Because you wanted a different outcome. That one didn't sit well with you. That one confirmed that the FCA dropped the ball, and the hierarchy did not want that going out. Simple as that. Why else take the guy off the complaint? He's been investigating it for 13 months, and he didn't leave the FCA because he's still there. I know that for a fact. I've checked that. So let's move on to the FCA APM. Now, this is the 12th of October, and what I'm going to go through now is a series of freedom of information requests that I sent to the FCA in the days following this annual public meeting that was held on 12th of October 2022. On each one of these, I copied the Treasury Select Committee and Andy as well, the Transparency Task Force. Let me just go back, because now the Freedom of Information Act exists for one reason and one reason only. And that is so that we, the consumers, or the media, or can hold public bodies to account for everything they say and everything they do, right? So they say something, you have the right to say, oh, you said this, but, and challenge it or ask for information in respect to it. So, and I sent 6 freedom of information requests to the FCA, each one of them specific to a representation that Mark Stewart had made at the APM specific to Blackmore Bond. He made these representations with Mr. Rathie present, so presumably Mr. Rathie was agreeable to those and approved of those representations, because he made no effort at any time to correct Mr. Stewart. And and it was quite clear that some of the responses were a bit canned or pre-prepared. So the first one, so this is what, this was the disturbing one. This is as you can see here, I include the actual quote from the transcript here, right? So Mark Stewart opens with just a little background. Blackmore bonds were offered to consumers to raise money to develop properties and pay a return to these bond holders. Those bonds represented unsecured loans from consumers to a company, right? He was saying there and then that Blackmore bond was not an investment, but instead people loaned money. These were literally loans, unsecured loans from the customer. Astonishing. And the first time, in October 22, the first time the FCA had come up with this line of defence. Now, you can almost see that, Panorama's dropped the pebbles in the pond. Oh, how are we going to? I know. Let's just pretend they weren't investments at all, and therefore we'll try and boost them and kick them out of our perimeter altogether. So, it's astonishing that he would make that representation. So, and ironically, it appeared that line was pre-planned, but then later in the same transcript, he starts referring to Blackmore bonds, this kind of investments, or people that invested in Blackmore bonds, or £47 million was invested. Well, it was either an investment, Mark, or it was a loan. He didn't say loaned, it was an investment. And he made the same representations in the Sunday Times damage limitation articles. And he was also claiming that the FCA didn't have the powers. It does have the powers, it just chose not to use them on this occasion. So I quote Stewart again, where he said, while the FCA does everything in its power to protect consumers and help them make informed decisions, there's no absolute safety net, and that regulator cannot insulate, protect, or immunise customers from risky consequences of every investment decision. And he says, Stewart said the FCA had no power to stop people investing in Blackmore, not loans, investing. So, and this is what the IFA were reporting. Again, here's an example of a Facebook loan that the IFA sent in to Mark Stewart himself in March 2018. Where does it say, it's a loan? Invest your savings, right? Income certainty, bonds, right? It's not a loan. It was an investment. So, and that's what it's clearly investigating. And at the bottom, I asked him for the FCA to provide information to explain why Mr. Stewart yesterday sought to reclassify Blackmore bond as unsecured lending as opposed to an investment. And he did so for the benefit of the public and media with an apparent intent to mislead the public, media and the victims and create desired sound bites. And I also asked, can the FCA explain why Mr. Stewart, with the apparent approval of Nicola Rathie, who was present at the meeting, made no attempt to correct Stewart on this? And it's an absolute false and misleading narrative. And I'm just going to refer you. This is, and again, the FCA clearly don't know the amount of evidence I've got. This is the 49-page 2018 information memoranda that was sent out to potential investors. If you look at the top right here in the search box, I put the word invest. It's found on 42 pages of the 49-page document, right? So, it's an invest. That word appears, right? The word investor, found on 32 pages within the information memoranda. The word investment, found on 36 pages of the investment memorandum, right? This is an example page from there, right? Investment highlights. Look how many investments, investors, right? It's an investment, all right? So, and if you, this is the search for the word loan, right? As claimed by the FCA. It appears once. And the only time it appears is in this paragraph here, and where it's and it's in reference to secured loans from third-party lenders or banks. It's not got nothing to do with investors. The word loan appears once in a 49-page document, and yet the FCA would have you believe that these were unsecured loans by these people, not investments. It was an investment. End of story. Period. So it's clearly an attempt to retrospectively reclassify. And to be very clear, it does not matter what the FCA reclassifies them as now. All that matters is what these retail investors were told they were in the marketing material on which their decision to invest was based. They were clearly marketed as an investment. But let's not forget, the FCA has form for this type of retrospective reclassification and to the detriment of victims. They are currently being sued by the APPG Business Banking for doing the same to victims of IRHP fraud by banks, right? It's how the hell can they sit there at that APM and say these were secured loans, not investments? Just astonishing. Right, next FOI request. And again, it quotes Mr. Stewart as saying, it does everything in its powers to provide a safety net, yada, yada, yada. And, you know, this is in that Times interview, he said, consumers have been marketed a risk-free investment. I mean, again, like, how many ways do you want to contradict yourself and tie yourself in knots? I'm trying to skim through these because I'm conscious of the time. So having made the statements to the Sunday Times quite correctly, because there can be no such thing as a guaranteed investment, you know, here, Mark Stewart, and this is where we get into some nitty-gritty here, he says part of the proposition to consumers was involved something called a capital protection scheme. It was actually called the capital guarantee scheme, again, but not really a word he wants to use, guarantee, because obviously he's confirmed there's no such thing as a guaranteed or risk-free investment. So he highlights that the capital protection scheme offered amounts of up to £75,000 for losses arising from the investment, not secured loan or unsecured loan, investment. The insurer is a legitimate insurer, right? We understand that claims have been made, but no, there has not been a payment, and the liquidator, an insurer, there's more to play out, okay? So, but and he says again here, in addition to the way in which legislation operates Blackmore bonds, unregulated firm able to issue mini bonds without being regulated by the FCA, that's outside of perimeter. Garbage, because what he fails to mention is that not one, not two, but three FCA authorised and regulated insurance brokers were responsible for arranging this insurance, right? Now that's within their perimeter. And one of the overriding factors that an insurance professor told me is that an insurance broker has to make sure that the product is appropriate, really. Okay. It's appropriate, yeah? So you can't get the insurance from the EU or the UK for obvious reasons, because it's just complete garbage. So you get it from a firm in Costa Rica. And I understand the commissions that the brokers received were substantial, but they clearly wasn't appropriate. And proof is in the pudding. You don't need the hindsight. This was never going to pay out because it had two exemptions in there. It said it wouldn't pay out in the event of fraud by directors, or that if the portfolio wasn't properly diversified. In those two things, you have pretty much every reason why an investment of this type collapses, for one or both. And in this case, you had both. You had fraud by the firm and directors, and it wasn't diversified because it was all in property. So again, Mark Stewart tying himself in knots. So I quite reasonably asked, you know, why Mr. Stewart is now referring to and relying upon representations as this capital guarantee scheme, which is an investment insurance product that was used to dupe consumers into believing this was a risk-free investment, and appeared to make this a risk-free investment, having earlier told us sometimes there can be no such thing. Can the FCA explain why these investment products that seek to guarantee investments, or these insurance products, and make them risk-free, have not been prohibited by the FCA, given that A, there can be no such thing as investment insurance, and B, they are used to create the illusion of risk-free investments, and C, we now have evidence of numerous such investment insurance products all having refused to pay out for one reason or another. And that is clearly an issue the FCA is aware of, because it's been going on for over a decade. I thought Blackmore Bond was unique. Oh, I mean, insurance investment, whoever Who would have ever thought of it? After Panorama, we got loads of people coming forward with similar investments that had the similar guarantee. And funnily enough, none of them paid out. So, and I asked them for information. Dame Gloucester referred to the use of halos to dupe investors. All of this was part of the halo process that these frauds were using. So Stuart's made a statement. I've asked for information to explain why his statement at the APM contradicted previous representations he's made, and for information as to what the FCA knew about these investment products. The FCA refused to provide the information, claiming this was vexatious. So, whereas all I'm trying to do is hold them to account for what they've said and why, and highlight the contradictions, and ask the FCA to give me the information to explain why there's all these contradictions. So, not vexatious is actually and absolutely, literally, what the FOA is for. Now, this is the shocker. As I said before, Mark Stewart called this insurer, said this insurer is a legitimate insurer. Oh, really? So the Costa Rican, after the Panorama, I got given a document by somebody who've been investigating insurance scams, particularly by these reinsurers and everything else. And this document contains disturbing references to somebody called Robert Harrison. Now, Robert Harrison is the Ion underwriter who's involved in the underwriting the Blackmore Bond capital guarantee scheme. His name's on all the correspondence and everything else, right? So, and I sent the FCA this dubious reinsurance document that this person put together, and it's a brilliant document. It's very succinct to the point, unlike me, and summarizes all these frauds and everything, and has all these links in here. Harrison, right, director of underwriting at Ion, was the former owner of an insurance firm by the name of Northern and Western Insurance Company, and I refer them to this article from the Daily Mirror, and this one from the Guardian. So it features the collapse of many other UK property investments, including the collapse of Key Homes Group in 2014, long before Blackmore Bond, and there's no way this wasn't on the FCA's radar. Right, so investors in Key Homes Group Limited were also duped by this guarantee of investment, and it was by Harrison's company. So as you can see here, investors in a property scheme thought they were in safe hands because they were being advised by a law firm and protected by an insurance policy. But 882 people were stung for almost 53 million when it collapsed, and the insurance company that supposedly protected the deposits also collapsed and failed to honour the policies. Robert Harrison's company, and it turned out that they never had more than 78,000 in capital when they were selling insurance for this 53 million investment. Now, this isn't the only issue that he's been involved in. He's been banned from the insurance business in the US for, and quote, fraudulent and dishonest practices and having wholly misappropriated premiums. And there is a whole litany of other cases which he's been involved in, which is included in that document. And Stewart called him a legitimate insurer. But it gets worse. So, and there's a great article here about Harrison and his checkered past, and reveals even more. However, they don't only employ Harrison. They've got another guy, David William King. He's their senior compliance officer at Ion in Costa Rica. And his bio reads, responsible for admin duty and compliance issues, yada, yada. 40 years insurance and reinsurance experience in the London and international markets. Wow, underwriting management, all this palaver. However, we'll come back. So, it's the same David William King who's the subject of an FSA final notice dated 4th of June 2007, right? And you have to read this notice. I recommend anyone click that link in afterwards and read the bloody notice, right? This is what the FSA was saying about it. Mr. King's conduct poses a serious risk to consumers and the financial system in general. His conduct was below the standards of competence and capability. And he says that here, there was no cover in place at all. The insurer didn't have liquid assets. Mr. King's reputation below the level required of participant in the insurance industry has failed to meet the standards. He's not a fit and proper person. I mean, but according to Mark Stewart, the APM, legitimate insurer, right? This is a firm of cowboys, right? And these people with a history of insurance fraud and misappropriation of insurance premiums. And yet Stewart at the APM refers to them as a legitimate insurer. Absolute shocking. Either Stewart was unaware of any of this, which how can he be unaware of any? One of the notices an FCA final notice, or he lied. Just to try and establish the credibility of this thing, and again, to try and highlight the fact they haven't dropped the ball. So in respect to that, as you can see here, I make a series of requests for information from the FCA to explain why Mr. Stewart would refer to this firm as a legitimate insurer, given all that information and evidence. This isn't me making up, this is evidence to prove that this company was far from a legitimate insurer. So freedom of information act purpose, hold them accountable for things they say. Mr. Stewart said they're a legitimate insurer. I provide evidence to prove they're anything but, and ask the FCA for information to explain why. They dubbed this, they refused to provide information, claiming this was vexatious as well. So these complaints are all in train and are being challenged significantly. So, but maybe Mr. Griffith, HMT and the Treasury Select Committee would like to ask these questions of the FCA themselves and try and get to the bottom of this, because that's all I was trying to do. They made representations. I had evidence to prove that that was wrong, incorrect or false. I provided the evidence to support it and asked them for information to explain why the contradiction is there, and they've refused to provide it. So, and I could go on for ages. So, as I say, I included this is just to show that there was an attachment of that dubious insurer's document that went in with that FOI request. So they had all the evidence and they've tried to bury it. So this one really sticks in my craw. This is Stewart says, he tries to say around 47 million was invested in Blackmore. Of that, 2,200 people. We received about 36 complaints. 36, not a high amount. I mean, he is literally using the relatively low number of complaints made to the FCA as a reason to imply that these people didn't care, right? They didn't care about this investment. They couldn't be bothered to complain. Well, why would they complain? You've done everything you've done in the press in the preceding years was to tell people it wasn't your perimeter. It was nothing to do with you. And the early investors that did complain received a complete fob-off response, whereby they said that they were deferring investigation of the complaint because there was ongoing regulatory action. And this was being shared by the investors that had made these early complaints with all the other investors on significant groups and everything else. So why would anyone else complain when they know that investors are being told we're deferring your complaint indefinitely? And these people have had deferrals now every month for 2 years. They're just kicking it into the long grass. And so who is going to complain when they're aware that that's the response you're going to get? You're going to wait until you hear from others what's going on. So, but he tries to use that as a reason to imply that these people didn't care or these people weren't affected enough to care. Couldn't be more further from the truth. And it's a shocking, disingenuous act by Stewart. I don't know why that annoys me more than most of the other stuff, but it does. And it just shows that his complete lack of understanding and empathy of the impact. So I go in here to, again, establish why, people didn't complain because they were telling everyone to MPs and nothing within their control. So I asked for information why Mr. Stewart used a low number of complaints to apply a lack of significance, a lack of impact and disinterest by victims, when the FCA has essentially told the world, the media and everyone that it was nothing to do with the FCA, so don't bother to complain to us. I don't know. Yeah, so this is reference to the fob-off responses that various victims were getting, and I actually include the 2 fob-off responses down the bottom there. They're attached to the email to show, well, what do you expect, and can you explain why you would do such a thing to these investors and downplay their damages? Right. So this one here, I'm trying to remember what one this is now. So again, this is another freedom of information request, and again, I outline what Mark Stewart said. Okay, what his representation was. There it is. Now this is really important. The information is Mark Stewart confirms that they've been investigating to make sure that the information that's been provided to consumers in those marketing materials was accurate, was clear, and was not misleading. Now he uses those words: fair, clear, accurate, clear, and not misleading, because that's an obligation under COBS, right? FCA COBS. All these communications have to be fair, clear, and not misleading. And these were approved by NCM Fund Services, right? The opening page of the thing, FCA authorised firm. They're using this firm to create the halo. But that firm has an obligation to confirm that everything within that material, if they're approving it, they are essentially saying that everything within that document is accurate, fair, clear, and not misleading. Now, he says on 12th of October, our work in relation to this is virtually complete at this stage. It does look as though those financial promotions were largely accurate in what they set out and contain very, very relevant risk warnings for consumers. Really, he's emphatic, appropriate, and contain very relevant risk warnings for consumers. However, I've attached the Blackmore Bond Series 4 brochure again, and this is the one that he refers to. And on the various pages throughout, and I'm going to skim these because again I'm conscious of time. Again, it's all referred to as an investment, yada yada yada, and there are risk warnings here, but every time there's a risk warning, it's overridden by the frequent representations made within the document as to the investment being secured against the assets first, and then also guaranteed by insurance, right? Particularly, but not exclusively, the following content. So how secure is it? Oh, here we go. First one, page 9. Insured by capital protection scheme. How secure is it? Multi-layered security risk, capital protection. Page 13. I mean, it goes on and on and on, right? It outlines risk, but everywhere it does, there's an inclusion of something that confirms there is no risk. Okay, so again, the bonds will be secured to seek to protect bondholders in the event of a default. They put in place security protection, right? In the case of any shortfall default in repaying bondholders, capital protection scheme is in place. So, and it goes on throughout the entire document. The full investment value of the bonds will be secured, right? I mean, it's relentless throughout. Okay, I mean, and he's saying that there was adequate risk warnings. I mean, they did have warnings of risk, but wherever they included it, they said in the event of that risk happening, we've got a capital guarantee protection scheme. So they essentially mitigated any risk. So it's irrelevant. You can't say that there is a risk and say that's a risk warning when it's accompanied by multiple statements and representations that is all guaranteed. Absolute nonsense. And so Stewart, he has to know that that is not appropriate. So had he looked at this document, or was he just lying when he said there were very adequate and appropriate risk warnings? Because there clearly weren't. And I don't know any professional who's looked at this who said they were adequate. Absolutely astonishing. So, and again, I say it just goes on and on and on. So I asked, again, made requests for information to explain why Stewart would say that there was adequate risk warnings when clearly there wasn't. This was as false or misleading as you can possibly get. So, but other false and or misleading representations, right? So here I include several really important claims that are made by Blackmore Bond in the document. Right now, this one here, page 20. The investment brochure claims that 16 projects have been completed by Blackmore Bond between 2016 and 2018, generating total completed sales of 28,146,000 and a profit of 20% per development. Impressive, right? So I asked the FCA, are any of the claims made by this Blackmore Bond investment brochure as to completed Blackmore Bond or Blackmore Group projects and their values and returns correct? And so I asked questions to, okay, you've said these are accurate. Okay, please provide the information to prove that these things are accurate. Well, not surprisingly, it was labelled vexatious, but there's a reason, right? This page here is what purports that establishes a track record. If you read that, you go, wow, these guys are good, right? 28 million in sales, 20% profit. Who wouldn't invest in that? It took me less than 5 hours to determine that every one of them investments had nothing to do with Blackmore Bond, like literally nothing, right? So how on earth is that? And the FCA, Mark Stewart, said that they've investigated this thoroughly, and they said the whole document is largely accurate, whereas this is entirely false, and it was approved by NCM Fund Services. So what is Stewart doing, trying to absolve NCM Fund Services of any responsibility or failure? This could not be more misleading, more false, and yet was signed off by NCM, and Stewart's trying to absolve them of blame. Well, NCM is one of, as I've mentioned before, there's 3 FCA regulated insurance brokers involved, but the total number of FCA authorised firms involved in Blackmore, and don't forget, this is something that from the outset they said was all beyond their perimeter authority and powers, there's 7 FCA authorised firms involved in Blackmore Bond to one extent or other. So is Mark Stewart, how you can claim that's accurate and it's fair, clear, and not misleading when it's entirely false is beyond me. And it begs, is Stewart and the FCA seeking to absolve all these FCA regulated firms of any responsibility so they can say, see, if we had looked at it in 2017, there was nothing to see here. They hadn't done anything wrong. But, that to me is the only explanation for this, because it's the only way they can make that fit. They're falsifying and changing the narrative again to make it fit with those statements they've made previously. This was false. It was a false representation with intent to make financial gain, and it's in this bloody document. And it was signed off by an FCA authorised firm, and yet Stewart says this was accurate. Complete nonsense. But what's interesting, I'll cover this. This is the FSMA specific stuff. Mentions NCM. That they've approved the financial promotion, and again that makes it squarely within the thing. And don't forget the earlier FOI, Freedom of Information Response in July 2020, confirmed that NCM was responsible from March 2017 for approving these regulations. So again, squarely within FCA remit from the start, breach of FSMA and COBS, and the FCA dropped the ball by wrongly claiming there was no breach of FSMA or COBS and no regulated activity taking place when it was absolutely false. There was, and this proves it. So, again, and it points out it's restricted to certain categories of super investors. The FCA are already aware of that, but we've already provided evidence, so they were being coached to self-certify. And again, I make requests for information to explain all of these contradictions, between what Stewart said and the contemporary record and evidence. Now, that again, the purpose of the Freedom of Information Act. The FCA have said we're not providing that information because that's vexatious. No, Mark Stewart lied. I provided the evidence to prove he lied and asked the FCA for information to explain why there was a difference. If he hadn't lied, fine, but give me the information to prove or explain why there's that contradiction between what he said on the documentary record. That's not vexatious. That is doing what the Freedom of Information Act is there for. That's holding them to account for what they've said or what they've done. And throughout the document, the FCA halo appears, page 4, page 15, page 26. There's repeated reference to FCA authorised firms and people. And again, 30, 31, 32, right? So, and attached to it, again, there was the bond document that I attached. Now, this is, largely accurate nonsense. It was completely dishonest and false what was in there. So they've refused to provide any information, right? Now, having refused to provide any information or even respond to my Freedom of Information request, they've made these, Stewart said, our work is virtually complete and these documents were largely accurate. That was in October 12th. However, in late November, Mark Stewart writes a letter personally to Rosie Cooper MP, who's had a constituent write to her, and she's asked the FCA. And in it, Mark Stewart completely backtracks from a conclusion 6 weeks earlier. He says, we are closely examining the adequacy of the financial promotions issued by Blackmore and aspects of the sales process. Our work is ongoing and we will take appropriate action if we identify breaches of the rules. Hang on, Mark. 6 weeks earlier, you said that was virtually complete and it was all largely accurate, nothing to see here, so we're done. But I highlight that that was false, and then 6 weeks later, you don't respond to me, but you are now changing the narrative when you communicate with MPs. You are literally falsifying the narrative and making it up as you go along. But it wasn't just Stewart. This quote here, Rathie says exactly the same in December to the Treasury Select Committee. So 2 months after the FCA have said, oh, all virtually complete, all largely accurate, he backtracks from it as well. So again, just making the narrative up as they go along. So, and if my response was vexatious, then why have you changed the narrative, Mark and Mr. Rathie? Why have you changed the narrative if what I've said in my Freedom of Information Act is vexatious? It clearly it was on the money because you changed the narrative. So here we have the FCA making false and or misleading representations, and so have City of London Police, Action Fraud, and the NFOB doing likewise, suppressing and concealing evidence of fraud by Blackmore Bond on directors. As mentioned earlier, after I make the report to Action Fraud and basically force City of London Police into a corner by giving them the evidence and not enabling this fob off, no lines of inquiry, they confirm that the various stakeholders have all decided they're going to have the Insolvency Service investigate. So, and in consultation with it's determined the Insolvency Service will undertake the initial investigation if appropriate. So, having done that, I contacted the insolvency. I gave them a load of information and everything else. However, since the Panorama broadcast, the FCA steward and Nicky Rathi have all stated that the insolvency service had investigated Blackmore Bond and its directors. And this is the actual reference from Mr. Rathi's letter to the Treasury Select Committee. The insolvency service has now examined the failure of Blackmore and completed its inquiries into the firm and conduct of the directors. The insolvency service has confirmed that he's not proposing to take any action. However, he didn't just say that in the letter. When he appeared before the Treasury Select Committee, Mr. Rathi interrupted Richard Lloyd, who was making the point, so that Mr. Rathi could make the point that the insolvency service investigated and concluded not to take any action. He was now, I point you to the wording. He was very careful with his words. His statement implies that the insolvency service must therefore have found no evidence of any wrongdoing or fraud, or that Blackmore Bond was not part of the Ponzi scheme. However, he's careful not to say that. Why? Because he knows full well that would be a false representation. And if he does not know it would be a false representation, then he is confirming gross misconduct and failures by the FCA and the insolvency service in terms of properly investigating, right? So, because he knows full well it's a fraud and it was part of the Ponzi scheme, because I basically shared the information with the insolvency service and the FCA to prove it. So how can, he doesn't say that they found no evidence of wrongdoing. He says they concluded not to take any action. He's inferring that they found no evidence of wrongdoing. But I asked the Treasury Select Committee and Mr. Griffiths, perhaps ask Mr. Rathi, are you saying, therefore, that the insolvency service and the FCA found no evidence of fraud, wrongdoing, or that the Blackmore Bond was part of the Ponzi scheme? Ask that question and see if his answer is consistent with what he tried to imply in that wording. So, and here's how we know that the FCA, City of London Police and the Insolvency Service are all well aware that Blackmore Bond involved fraud and was part of the Ponzi scheme. So, liquidators Kroll were bound to provide a report to the Insolvency Service within 3 months of their employment and included the following concerns. During our preliminary investigations, we identified a significant number of matters relating to the company and the wider group that require investigation. That was in June 2020. But we know that the Insolvency Service didn't lift a finger until June 2021, and only then after action fraud. However, another source has provided me with this statement from the joint liquidators also wrote, the joint administrators contacted the FCA shortly following their appointment in April 2020 and provided them with details of what they and their legal advisors consider to be regulatory failings of various parties involved in the company's business, together with information in their possession which we believe to be relevant. The joint liquidators have followed this up with the FCA on several occasions. The joint liquidators do not have visibility in the progress of any work being undertaken by the FCA in relation to the company. The FCA is ring-fencing it and not responding to these most serious concerns raised by the liquidators. So again, the FCA is well aware of the full extent of what's gone on here. And here is a real key. You might recall, John, the opening of the Panorama, you saw John Robbins, former military veteran, served with distinction, and he comments and arrives at one of the directors' houses and looks at the great house, everything else. Well, would it surprise you to know that John didn't actually invest in Blackmore Bond? He invested in something called Blackmore Estates. And John, after a presentation I did for Transparency Task Force, John got in touch, and so did another investor. And both of them had invested in something called Blackmore Estates. This was a previous Nunn and McCreesh investment vehicle, and they had told them, yeah, it's performed brilliantly with, your investment has made £5,000 interest. However, rather than return them, how about invest in this brand new and even better vehicle called Blackmore Bonds? So, and alarm bells were ringing, and I asked both, did they return your principal that you invest in Blackmore Estates and this interest they claimed that had been made to you first before you invested? No. They basically sold them on Blackmore Bond and said, don't worry, we'll just transfer your maturing investment and all the profits into Blackmore Bond. So that's a flag for me. So I helped them both. I drafted emails to send to liquidators and asked Kroll, can you confirm that an investment was made on each of their behalf for that amount on the dates in question they were told? Kroll came back and confirmed, yes, we can confirm that company records show that an investment was made on each of their behalves on the date for that amount. So, which is fine, which is great. So then I crafted a follow-up for the investors and asked them, can you please provide information to show the transfer or credit of cash or collateral to Blackmore Bond in their bank accounts in my name for that amount on or around those dates. Yeah, the Kroll had to confirm that, you know, there was no transfer of cash or collateral from Blackmore Estates to Blackmore Bond on or around those dates for those amounts. Ponzi scheme. That is a Ponzi scheme. They have told. So if you're aware of Madoff or all these other Ponzi schemes, there's a legitimate front of a business. So you have two sets of company records. So the company records were clearly determining, yes, an investment had been made because they had to keep track of it. However, the bank accounts were showing that no transfer of cash was made. And Kroll have confirmed that there were a total of 20 such Ponzi transfers from Blackmore Estates into Blackmore Bond, right? And this doesn't include any other Nunn & McCreesh vehicles or any other vehicles from any of their cronies that are operating similar scams, right? To be very clear, Blackmore Bond was part of a Ponzi scheme. That's a criminal enterprise. That's fraud, right? And the Insolvency Service knew it, the FCA knew it, and they are all trying to absolve the directors and the company of fraud and criminality. And Mr. Rathie, as I said, this is why he was so careful with his words. The Insolvency Service investigated, but they have concluded not to take any action. He absolutely avoids saying they found no evidence of wrongdoing. So, I mean, is it dishonest by Mr. Rathie and the FCA or disingenuous? Either way, it was misleading and he implied something. And I would dearly like people to challenge the Treasury Select Committee and MPs to challenge him on that and challenge any of this evidence I've got here. Because again, I'm not saying this without evidence. I've got the evidence to back it up. And also, Kroll also confirmed to me that they shared the same concerns that I had, that this was a part of a Ponzi scheme. And these are the guys that have had access to the records. So they are fully aware and they've raised these concerns before. So, and I'm nearly at the end, Andy, it won't be long, right? So let's just recap where we are, right? And since Blackmore Bond, since Panorama, I've been deluged with information and everything else. And I do try and respond to everybody, but I literally am one bloke doing it in my spare time, you know, albeit I'm getting some great help from the victims themselves, who do themselves a disservice because they're not aware of how good they've been and how diligent they've been and how effective they've been. It will all pan out. So we already know that 46 million was invested in Blackmore Bond, right? We know that just under 7 million was paid to Surge for inducing investors into the fraud. We know that 2 million was paid to Aspinall Chase, the Gibraltar-based company owned by Nunn & McCreesh. We also know that 1 million was paid to the Blackmore Bond parent company for the services rendered by Nunn & McCreesh. What those services, who knows? So we therefore know that approximately 36 million was available for the investment purpose. So, right, so this is a spreadsheet that I've put together that collates different pieces of information. On the left, these are the various assets that Blackmore Bond owned at the time of its collapse in April 2020. And if you can see here in the third column, these are the current site values that Blackmore Bond had assigned to these various assets. And you can see down here, 22.8 million. Okay, 36 million in, 22.8, okay. You know, where's the other 13? But maybe there's construction costs or other costs that haven't yet been realised, or yeah. However, I'll refer you to this bottom right corner. The total amount of secured lending from credit institutions and lenders, 18.2 million, all secured against these assets, right? And these are the named Close Brothers assets, Nextius, Amicus, all like sort of bridging, like well, not the best quality lenders. Right, so 18.2 million secured lending, all secured against the same assets. Well, hang on. So you take away that lending, that leaves 4.6 million. Okay, where's 36 million available after all these obscene costs were paid? There's 4.6 million left after the secured lenders. Where's the rest of it gone? Where's the other 31.4 million gone? And I highlight these ones here in red because there's evidence to suggest that these, as you can see, these are significant developments. It doesn't appear that there was any security charge in favour of the investors, of the bondholders, just the lenders. So, in fact, this gap between the secured lending and the asset value, the equity, so to speak, is actually probably far less than 4.6 million. But let's just go for the moment with 4.6 million, right? Where'd the rest of the 31.4 million go? Well, my following of threads led me to this. This is the, I don't know if you're aware of it, but this is basically the database for investigative journalists. And it's this contains all the Panama Papers and all these offshore leaks that have made the headlines. This stuff revealed David Cameron's offshore interest and all these other personal. Well, in there, there's this company, BG Holdings Finance Limited, registered in the British Virgin Islands. So this is in the Panama Papers. Who are the beneficial owners of this offshore vehicle in British Virgin Islands? Philip Nunn, Patrick McCreish. Nunn and McCreish, the beneficial owners of this offshore vehicle in BVI. So, and I have asked the Insolvency Service and the liquidators if they're aware of any other offshore vehicles other than the Isle of Man or Gibraltar entities that we featured in Panorama, and the answer is no. So, and this BG Holdings Finance is connected to another firm, and I'm still following that lead because this other firm has got 36 other connections. This Corinthian Trust, there's a whole can of worms here. So my question is, how much of that missing 31 million, and let's not forget, if there's 31 million missing, how can the Insolvency Service say there's no evidence of fraud or criminality here? How much of it ended up in BVI in this offshore vehicle belonging to Nunn and McCreish? Simple question. It's entirely valid. So, but literally in the last couple of weeks, we've now got evidence to show that the 2 million that was paid to Aspinall Chase in Gibraltar, the Nunn and McCreish Gibraltar-based business that they owned, was in fact used to pay 20% commissions to European-based firms and introducers who were introducing investors to Blackmore Bond. The evidence shows that these firms were generating falsified certification of sophistication of foreign investors and expat investors and producing QROPs, like Qualified Recognised Overseas Pension Scheme applications, that were then sent to pension trustees in the UK for release of pension money overseas. Once the pension money was out of the UK, it was then used to purchase life assurance bonds that were then used to invest in Blackmore and other scams. I mean, it's just a whole carousel of fraud and scams. We now have a dossier of the numerous firms and the various scams involved and a very good view of the whole picture. It is impossible that the FCA, the Insolvency Service and City London Police do not have the same information we now have and must have had it for years. If you haven't got this information, then what have you been doing for the 4.5 years that this investigation has been ongoing? So, as I say, if I can piece all this together, one person in my spare time, how on earth, it's inconceivable they couldn't. And when I say it's not just me, because again, I want to say that the incredible victims, I don't like using the word victim, but unfortunately, this is the only word that aptly describes what's happened here. You know, and also a group of like-minded individuals, some of whom are on this call today, who have been instrumental in doing their own work and sharing their work with me so that we can piece together the full picture. So despite all this evidence of a Ponzi scheme and fraud, yet the FCA, Insolvency Service, City London Police all refuse to take action, all continue to conceal and suppress the evidence and incredibly seek to exonerate the fraudsters and the seven FCA authorised firms that were involved to conceal the FCA's own failures and their prior and ongoing dishonesty. Because I cannot think of another reason why the FCA would be doing this. And we've got plenty of evidence now to suggest that the first criteria for the FCA, when they get a case in the door, how exposed are we? And everything, the way the FCA has acted in respect to this is consistent with that. So enough is enough. And I'm literally, and I want to direct this to Andrew Griffith and the Treasury Select Committee. Enough is enough. There must now be a full inquiry, and like there was for LCNF and the victims, but importantly, victims have to be compensated now and before the inquiry even begins, because liability and dishonesty by those public bodies has been clearly established. I mean, and I challenge anyone, if you want to come at me or take me on and say that anything I've said is false, by all means do so. You can't. It's all evidential based. So an inquiry has to take place. But the compensation like LCNF investors got because of the FCA failures has to be paid now and beforehand. And then the FCA can be at risk and the HM Treasury can be at risk for any losses not recovered. If they recover any losses, fine. Keep it and offset it against the amount you pay out. But there has to be an inquiry and the compensation must go to investors now, because every other week I'm hearing news that one of the pensioners or investors has died or passed away. How many more are going to have to do that before justice is done? When Football Index collapsed, and by the way, another thing where the FCA, 2018, yes, it's within our perimeter. 2019, yes, it's within our perimeter. 2020, yes, it's within our perimeter. March 2021, yes, it's within the FCA perimeter. It's an investment. Collapses in April 21, 100 million plus lost. The FCA immediately go to external counsel and get an opinion. No, it was never an investment product. So they literally for 3 years said it was, and as soon as it collapsed with losses, then sought to conceal their own findings, and that was only uncovered because it was part of the Gambling Commission and the Department for Media and Culture and Sport, who oversee the gambling, ordered an immediate inquiry in the May, and the findings were delivered by September, like 4 months. Enough's enough. Inquiry now. Let Dame Gloucester do it, because she can then obviously then highlight and investigate the parallels with LCNF. But investors and the victims need to be compensated now. Liability is done, right? It's in the bag. Compensate people now. FCA, put your hand up. People, heads should roll if need be. But let the FCA, City London Police and Insolvency Service, who all drop the ball on this, or all sought to conceal and suppress it. You run the risk of not recovering money, not the victims. Enough's enough. So I'll end it there.
Paul, thank you so much. That was absolutely remarkable. Ladies and gentlemen, before we do anything else, please put our hands together. You can just imagine the amount of time, effort and mental energy that went into that. It really was outstanding, Paul. Thank you so much. Thank you very much indeed. What we're going to do now, folks, we're going to give Paul a chance to catch his breath while Mark Bishop, who is like Paul, a long-standing member of TTF, Mark Bishop's going to give a brief kind of exec summary overview of the key points. We'll then sort of move to pass to Q&A discussion, because it looks like many of you want a chance to say other things. But Paul, that was superb, mate. Thank you very much indeed. Well done. Well done. Mark Bishop, to you, please. Just if you could give sort of a few minutes, please, Mark, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Andy, and thanks very much, Paul, for your forensic presentation and underlying investigation, and above all, for your persistence and bravery. Frankly, if only those qualities were present in the same quantities in some of the people who work at the FCA, we wouldn't be having this discussion now. There'd be no need for this symposium. It seems to me that there is a problem there with the culture of that organisation and some of the hiring decisions. It does seem to me very clear that the FCA's initial claim it had no powers to investigate were wholly wrong. It's not least clear by the fact that they now admit they have got those powers. It's pretty obvious as well that further evidence came to light while the scam was still operating, and that the regulator still failed to act appropriately. It's difficult to believe that that was mere incompetence. Also, it's now admitting that it has the powers, but strangely, it's wary of saying that it's finding wrongdoing. I think we should ask ourselves why that might be. Well, of course, if the FCA admits that there is wrongdoing now, then it must be inferring that its failure to act back in the day meant that it failed to protect consumers. And morally, at least, that means it's on the hook for their losses. It's much easier to say, we investigated and we found nothing. Because if there was nothing there was nothing there back in 2017, and therefore there was no opportunity to protect consumers. And this same behaviour happened in the Connaught London Capital Finance cases and many others. The FCA's kind of argument that there was nothing to see means that consumers don't get compensated, that negligent and dishonest firms within the regulatory perimeter don't get banned, fined or prosecuted, and scammers outside the perimeter also do not get prosecuted. In other words, in order to protect itself, the FCA has to hang out consumers to dry, both those affected already and those that will be affected by the next scams to be enabled by the same people. So how can this situation be solved? It seems to me there's only one answer. Remove the FCA statutory exemption from civil liability, so those who lose money through regulatory failure are compensated. Do that, and the minute the FCA realises it's dropped the ball, they'll pick it up, aware that the losses are racking up every day it takes them to close down the scam. And costs borne by the FCA are passed on to the industry via its levy. The industry doesn't want this open-ended liability, who would? So the industry will put pressure on the FCA to raise its game, and it has a lot more sway than we do. Until this happens, people will keep getting scammed, and every scam victim tells dozens of friends and family, and of course hundreds of thousands hear about it via the media. This scares away huge numbers of consumers from making legitimate investments in genuine schemes, because they realise that they can't tell which is the real one and which is the scam. And actually, we shouldn't blame them for that. It's not about their naivety or their lack of financial education, because, of course, the FCA cannot tell the difference between a real investment and a scam. They can't. What chance? Us. So the public and the honest majority in the industry are paying the price for protecting a complacent or captured regulator and the scammers. This is a situation that has to end. We at Transparency Task Force are engaging now very closely with the Treasury, and particularly with the current Economic Secretary to the Treasury, Andrew Griffith, making the case for amending the Financial Services and Markets Bill to amend the FCA's exemption from civil liability, and a couple of things as well. Other things as well, we want a genuine duty of care, and we want also the FCA to have a consumer oversight body that asks difficult questions and commissions things like independent reviews when there are regulatory failure cases, because at the moment the FCA can control those things itself, and therefore it ends up getting away with wrapped knuckles at the most. So those are things we're asking for. If those things are granted, actually the honest majority in the industry will gain, because consumer confidence will be boosted. The dishonest minority will lose out. The question for Mr. Griffith, I think, is whose side is he on? Is he on the side of the grafters, the savers, or is he on the side of the grifters and the criminals? I very much hope he's on our side. We're soon going to find out. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Paul.
Mark, thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed, Mark. That was a great summary. Very thought-provoking as always. Paul spoke about enough is enough, and he's right, isn't he? Yeah, enough is enough. We've seen enough of the same kind of opacity and obfuscation and excusiveness from the FCA. It really ought to put its hands up when it gets it wrong and put its efforts into putting things right, not trying to maintain a narrative that it didn't drop the ball in the first place. I wonder how much of the FCA's energies and resources are going into trying to stop people like us and Paul getting to the truth, as opposed to being out there trying to catch the bad guys and to regulate the bad actors. Enough is enough.